Good afternoon, and welcome to this session, the COSCA White Paper to Protect and Preserve Standards for Maintaining and Managing 21st Century Court Records. I think probably if you're here, you know about that whole dilemma of boxes and boxes of papers and mildew and spiders and crawling into horrible spaces trying to confiscate the records and hold them because it looks like the fire department's going to take them or someone's going to destroy the building and the records will be gone. This morning, Seth Matheson, our keynote speaker, gave us some very important advice. We cannot talk about the future until we know our past. And when he said that, immediately I saw those rooms and corners full of records. It's an appropriate introduction to this session. In any discussion about managing court records, we need to remember where we were, those dark rooms, where we are now in that transitional stage where we're trying to figure out what is the best technology to utilize to store our records and how long will that technology last, what's the downside of it, and where we want to go, which is a successful utilization of the technology to store our records without all of the accompanying drama with which we become familiar. So to bring clarity to this issue, we have two outstanding, knowledgeable presenters, Greg Linhares and Nial Raaen. Now, Mr. Linhares served as a Missouri State Court Administrator, as a commission counsel to the Supreme Court of Missouri, as counsel to the Majority Floor Leader in the Missouri House of Representatives, as staff attorney for the Joint Commission on Legislative Research. He's been in the JAG Corps. I don't know if you guys used to watch that on TV, but I loved it. This is JAG lawyer here, and he's also authored numerous articles. He's a graduate of Truman State University with a JD from St. Louis University School of Law and is a member of the Missouri Bar. And we have him today to talk to us about records management. In addition, we're very lucky to have Mr. Raaen here, another very informed speaker on the issue of managing court records. And Mr. Raaen is a National Center for State Court Management consultant who has worked in the United States and abroad. He has an interesting career. He has clearly climbed up the ladder, and perhaps he'll give us a presentation on how to do that. Okay. He began as a probation officer in the 14th District Court. Later, he became a district court magistrate, and still later, the court administrator and clerk in the 14th District. In 2002, he joined the Michigan Supreme Court as Director of Trial Courts, serving 244 trial courts. And he was responsible for training and implementation of the new time standards. As you know, he's currently at the National Center, so that's the way to go up the ladder. Mr. Raaen is a graduate of Vanderbilt. He earned an MA in Public Administration and Social Work. He is an ICM Fellow, and he has certificates in content management and records management. He's a certified records manager. So all the questions that you have, direct them to these two gentlemen. Join me in giving them a warm NACM welcome.
Thank you. That was excellent introduction, and I don't know how I'll be able to live up to all that hype that she just provided, but thank you all for having us here today. I am Greg Linhares. Just finished my term as Missouri State Courts Administrator and took a job with the federal courts. I am now the clerk of the court for the Eastern District of Missouri. So I'm a trial court administrator like many of you in this room are now. So I'm actually going to have to live with some of this stuff I wrote in this paper. It's not just going to have to be theory. I'm actually going to have to do it. And so the reason I'm here today primarily is that I was the principal author from the COSCA group for the 2013 COSCA white paper. Unfortunately, Richard Schaffler, who staffs our white paper committee at the National Center, made sure that I bumped into Nial so that our paper really made a lot of sense, because Nial is the one who did a lot of the heavy lifting on our paper in terms of how you implement these standards. So really, our approach today between Nial and myself is going to be I'm going to talk about at the high level in governance and structures and rules and how you get people to work together to help create these kind of systems. And Nial's really going to get more into the details of how it actually works and what are some of the national standards that you might see in other disciplines and how we're starting to catch up in courts. I think it's fair to say that records management in the courts is kind of on steroids right now. But we've been behind for a long time, but we're catching up quickly. And I kind of bounced that idea off of Nial before we came here while we were planning the session, and he kind of agreed. I mean, we've seen this has been going on in healthcare and other fields for a number of years. And in the last 3 to 5 years, you've seen courts really jump in full bore into electronic records management. But, you know, we're kind of like that big dog that's fully grown but doesn't know that it's full grown yet. It still thinks it's a puppy and it's chasing itself, and we don't quite know what we've got our hands on. We're doing it, but we don't quite know fully what it is. And so what we're trying to get at today is what is electronic records management in the 21st century? What are we doing? Where do we want to be going? And that's what COSCA was trying to take on in the paper that we wrote. Advance the slide here. There. So this was the name of our paper, and you can find it on our COSCA website. We also have Lori Dudgeon here, who's one of my compatriots in COSCA from the court administrator in Kentucky. So you can talk to either one of us about COSCA and what it is that we do on break if you'd like to know more about COSCA. But COSCA every year writes one of these papers, and NACM was gracious enough to start making the COSCA white paper one of the ongoing sessions that's going to come every year. So hopefully, if you keep coming back to this conference, you're going to keep seeing the COSCA white paper every year to facilitate communication between COSCA and NACM on these types of issues. And I think it's important to talk about, just at the very front end before I bring on Nial and let him start talking about some of the components of records management, what our white paper was and what our white paper wasn't. So we wanted to do a white paper because there's so much interest in developing standards for electronic records management. And we wanted to make sure that it was clear that record management needs to be done in a standard way. But that doesn't mean that it has to be done exactly the way the State Administrative Office of the Court says in every front. So this is not about state AOC trying to dictate terms to local courts. We were very careful to avoid that kind of language in the paper on purpose. And the reason for that is that standards will have to be implemented in local courts. And so what we're really talking about is a way to create dialogue between state courts and local trial courts in creating the standards. One thing the paper does say, though, is that once those standards are developed, that they really do need to be implemented in a uniform fashion or else they're of no value. We have you know, we were able in the paper world to maintain file the whatever way judge wants, right? Well, judge likes it this way, and then the other division wants to do paper the other way. Well, when you have an electronic records management standard and people are trying to pull that information back out of the system, regardless of geography, you have to have standards. And so that's why it becomes much more important in the electronic world to have and create those standards. And so we're talking about uniform implementation, not uniform case management systems, but uniform sets of data within whatever system it is that you have, okay? That's kind of what we're really getting at. Uniform training, uniform professionalism, uniform state rules, and those types of things. And then that's your job as professionals in the courts that are managing trial courts to make sure that happens. So that's the gist of our paper. And what Nial brings to the table with regard to that is access to some of the national standards that have been developed to help you measure those outcomes. And he's going to talk about a number of different groups that can help you and assist you, and he's even got a model that he's going to present at the end of the paper on how you can evaluate the success of your records management. So I'll start with that, and then I'll bring Nial on. He can talk a little bit about it.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. Well, I think records management, I've got it here listed as one of the essential components, and I don't think NACM has it listed as an essential component, but I think it's a real critical function of the courts. Because when you think about it, there's two things that we fundamentally do in the courts. One is make decisions, and the other is maintain records. So it's really at the core of what we do. I really appreciate COSCA taking on this issue this year. I think it's really quite timely. And I do want to give credit in terms of the development of the principles. They were really based on a set of principles that was developed by ARMA International. Does anybody in here belong to ARMA? Nobody? Okay. ARMA International is a records management organization, one of a couple of large organizations of records management professionals, and they developed a set of principles, a general set of principles, 8 principles in all, called, they refer to as GARP, the Generally Accepted Record Keeping Principles. We kind of adapted that and simplified it a little bit and tried to make it more relevant to the court environment. But that's really they deserve credit for sort of taking the lead on that, and want to make sure that you understand that. In what are records, there's a lot of definitions, but probably the most accepted definition generally is this one, which is an ISO standard. And again, it's looking at information that an organization uses in performance of its legal or administrative obligations. Very, very straightforward. There's also a definition out here for what court records are. And this was one that was developed in 2002 as part of another COSCA effort. And Alan Carlson is in the back, and he's reading this very carefully because Alan was the author of the co-author of this paper, which was our booklet developing COSCA guidelines for public access to court records, which is still a very good reference point. The key thing here is that we're talking about not only case records, but also all the other records that support court activities, including administrative records. So this, I think you covered the ground on this, Alan, so good job. Two quick concepts that I think are important when we talk about records, and this comes again from the records management community. One is that records have a life cycle. They're born, they live, they die, however you want to refer to it. And it's important that records are maintained through that whole continuum of the life cycle. As you indicated, we had all those boxes down in the basement that are molding and storing, and that really sort of says to me when I go into a court or an organization that they don't really buy the whole continuum of care. Fortunately, the electronic world is taking us away from having to maintain records in boxes and basements and other very unpleasant storage areas. But as we'll talk about later in this presentation, there still are some issues with continuum of care, particularly when it comes to archiving and disposing of records, electronic records, and we'll talk about that a little bit. This is becoming an increasingly complex area, the whole records management thing. I mean, when you say the term records management thing, oh boy, that's a topic to put you to sleep. But really, it's becoming a very dynamic field and area because of a number of reasons. As you all know, there's much more demand for court information. It's a much more complex system to manage, and I think that's one of the driving factors between developing a set of principles that you can use as a framework for overall records management.
And I kind of want to reflect a little bit on the principles that this paper was written about, and the challenges particularly that Nial was mentioning. We have the competing interests of access to the system and privacy of the individual. We're going to talk a lot about that, and that's a very important public policy notion that you have to think about when you're developing your standards. We meant these records you see here, access is the first one that we mentioned here. And the trend now that you're seeing is more and more toward privacy, particularly as it regards records that are managed by the government. People have more and more fear about what government is doing with their records. They are concerned about what the life cycle of that record is. They're concerned about what governments are doing with those records. Do you have policies in place that dictate who you can give those records to and when? Are people paying you for those records? Are they not paying you for those records? What does that say about you as a governmental organization if you're taking money from people who are getting those records from you? So there's public trust and confidence issues there, very high-level issues. This isn't just some sort of a policy that you put in place because you got to, because the auditor said. This is the kind of thing that really affects the public trust and confidence in the judiciary. And that's very important that you think about that when you're developing and implementing records management policies. And we talk a lot about in our paper about governance. And I won't get a ton into governance today because it's in the paper. And really what we're here to do is talk about implementation. But governance is a key factor that has to be dealt with up front. And the thing to remember about governance is that there's relevant case law that suggests this, and a number of the state constitutions that suggest this as well, that the state court system as a whole has a responsibility for governance of the record. Now, the implementation of that governance is done at the trial court level, but it's clear that the trend is toward the fact that particularly with these centrally managed electronic filing systems as they come on board, you know, our roles as clerks of court are changing. You're responsible for a record that sits somewhere else. And so what access and what rights do you have to that? And you have to think about those things in terms of policies. And we'll get into the answers to some of these questions later, but I just kind of wanted to throw those out as threshold principles that you got to think about. And that comes all the way through your life cycle. You know, preservation of your record, integrity of your record, you know, maintenance of that record and who you interface with. You know, as you build your interfaces to different agencies, the integrity of your record can come into question if you don't know what that end user is going to do with that data after you give it to them. How long are they going to keep it? Is their records management cycle going to be the same as your records management cycle? How are you going to hold them to that? You know, because once something's out there, it's out there forever. So those are issues to consider as we go through and think about records management. I'll introduce the principle of compliance. I think what we'll kind of do is I'll talk about the initial high-level principle, and now we'll get into more how you implement that principle. So compliance, if you want to think about records management as kind of a pyramid, compliance is the bottom of the pyramid. This is the thing that everybody has to do in order to maintain the record. So these are your statutory requirements. These are your rules of court. These are the orders that the court has set out as to the way in which that you are to manage that record. And so every system of management, records management you have has to be able to achieve basic compliance. So that means that your vendor has to be aware of your requirements. You can't, a lot of times you get into business with vendors, as many of you in this room know who've dealt with case management vendors. The vendor will say, well, this is the way we do business, and so you have to reform your process to meet with whatever our system is. We've got to rewrite our rules to meet with what the vendor says. Well, you better know at the front end whether or not you're willing to live with whatever that is, because if you're not going to meet basic compliance, and that's not acceptable, and that's something that you have to work out. So that affects, your IT purchasing, not just your records management and your rules, but also your IT purchasing process and all that. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of compliance. You have to be able to deal with statutes and court rules and all the basic things that records management has to do.
And as we indicated, we're really talking here about not only the case records that you manage as well, but the administrative records, financial records, personnel records, and so forth. Part of compliance is making sure that your staff understand what their responsibilities are, that's very clear for how long they're supposed to maintain records, how they do that, and so forth. Also that you have systems in place to ensure that your records are accurate and complete. Sometimes that involves audits and reviews. That's all part of compliance. And what you'll see with the principles here really is they're kind of interrelated, because when we're talking about compliance, we're also talking about integrity, and we're talking about, how long do you keep records? That's a compliance issue, and that goes into disposition and retention as well. So they're very much, the principles are very much interdependent in that sense. One thing that comes up a lot in the records management literature is the concept of unstructured records. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but what they're referring to is records which are typically not in a database like your case management system, but your office automation products, documents, and that sort of thing that may be in a filing system but really aren't part of the database. And the challenges that are associated with making sure that those records are in compliance, that they're maintained properly and for the right period of time. And it's become more complicated, of course, with the introduction of social media and managing web content. And under each of these principles today, we wanted to kind of touch on one issue that we think is particularly salient right now. And for this one, I picked the issue of email compliance. In the private sector, this has been a real hot button issue, particularly e-discovery. As private organizations are being sued or being required to provide information as part of civil litigation, the cost of accessing that information and the consequences of organizations not having systems that properly store and retrieve email in particular has become a major concern and a major issue. Now, it hasn't had as much attention in the private public sector until recently. And what agency was it that lost their emails on somebody's C drive here and ended up in front of Congress? The IRS. And that's really what this is about compliance, email compliance. The thing about, yeah,
Question.
yeah, comment or question?
We were going to ask the question.
Oh, we're gonna ask the question. Yeah, just a second, I wanna get the next slide.
Next slide.
Yeah. There are systems, of course, for managing email. There's automated systems, there's manual systems, and so forth. The important thing is recognizing that it's the content of email that's very, very important. Most email is really considered transitory or considered to be a non-record. In other words, it's not critical to the agency's functioning. But there's that small portion, and some have estimated that it's 5 to 10%, and who knows what it really is, that really is critical and needs to be addressed. The question we wanted to ask you all is, do any of you currently have products or systems that look at email, classify email, and store it according to content or value? Anybody? No? Okay.
Who even has an email policy?
How many have policies? Okay. All right.
What-
Play small point. Yes.
Yeah, I got sued again. And this is the first one where I kinda got the can, pleading says, you know,
Uh-huh.
the email hold.
Yes.
See more and more.
Yeah.
So, we went out and bought a product, and I can't remember the name of it, that allows us to store emails off the server, because one of the big problems we have managing emails is all the junk on our servers, and slowing down response time, managing that.
Sure.
Right? So how
Sure.
do you manage the rest of it without not being able to delete any email? So we
Right.
just get a product that basically just ships everything over here.
So you just archive it.
Yeah.
Yeah, essentially archive it. Yeah.
But
Okay.
to my best of my knowledge, it doesn't, I've built, it's a good question when I get home.
Yeah.
To what extent does it sort?
Yeah. It's a tough issue because, you know, you can buy products that do this automatically, but there's no guarantee that they're accurate. On the other hand, you can have staff try and do it and tell them what boxes to put it in and how to organize it, but sometimes that doesn't work very well either. Probably a combination of the two is probably the, you know, the ideal approach. It's interesting that one of the records management organizations offered a course on email management a couple of years ago, and I think they gave up because I don't think they really could, really couldn't wrap their arms around the issue. But I think as a starting point, the first thing is important that you start to think about having an email policy, an email retention policy, and a preservation policy. Has anyone else had litigation experience, or any of you in federal courts have any experience with it? Okay. Well, you know, fortunately, knock on wood, we're lucky so far. As I say, it's been a big issue in the private sector, and you know, sooner or later, it's probably something that we're going to have to deal with. So that's we think that's the hot topic right now as far as this principle is concerned.
Yeah, I was curious too, that those of you that have a policy, I mean, what does it say? I mean, what is your email policy? Is it just, is related to court-related records only? Is it a general kind of an HR email policy? Does it say when you're supposed to destroy things? Somebody that raised their hand has a policy. If you, anybody want to offer anything?
Yeah.
My policy really has to do more with their HR and how employees are to manage their emails, basically that it's not their own private emails, that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah. And I think HR is probably where there's the greatest risk for us as managers, you know, in HR-related exchanges and information on that. Alan, you had a comment?
Yeah, the same issue that some of it's about what you should use and not use email for.
Yeah, okay.
We've also gotten into the retention issue to head out the problem with lifecycle. We've got a standard retention policy that we follow that says everything gets thrown away after X years. That can protect you in litigation up to a point.
Up to a point.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, we have an IT policy where we get rid of anything, any trash after 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have anything that had, but the problem is the volume of all the emails is in the cent.
Yeah.
That's thousands of them, and even, you know, so
Yeah.
to the extent that we're managing our trash.
Yeah, yeah. It's a complex issue. It's complex to identify what's critical, and then when you're dealing with email streams and, you know, what's the final version and those sorts of things. But unfortunately, we don't have a silver bullet to offer. Yeah, Norm?
Yeah, similar to what the others have said, our policy deals with appropriate of our email systems and that sort of thing, and then also privacy issues.
Okay.
And the big message there is that there's no expectation of privacy of anybody in the court to whatever they're using the email system for, and that the court
Okay.
or the government can
Yeah.
look at it in an appropriate circumstance anytime they want to.
Yeah.
So it's-
And just as an interesting footnote, in Europe, it's the opposite. And email is considered, I believe, considered essentially the property of the sender, which is kind of an interesting concept, which I hope doesn't cross the pond. But anyway. Okay.
Okay, next principle we have is the principle of integrity. It addresses the need for records to be created and preserved in a manner that guarantees authenticity, reliability, and accessibility. And we're going to talk a little bit about what each of those words means. But I mean, authenticity, it takes on greater importance when you see how many people are out there purporting to manage court records, or asking you to buy their court records, or soliciting you to download bulk data about court records from them. So the authenticity of an electronic record has to be proven in a way and maintained in a way that's consistent. And how does the end user know that this is the real court record and not one that they purchased online from who knows what vendor on who knows what date? And even if it was accurate at the time that they bought it, it may not be accurate anymore. And so it has to, the record has to be proven to be what it purports to be, and sent by the person who was purported to send it. Okay, and reliability is slightly different than authenticity. We rely on the court record to be, the data entry, the minute entries that we make in our systems and all these types of things, that they are legally operative in a sense, in a lot of ways. And I think that's a new concept for us. I mean, in the old days, you had the paper file and something was docketed, and there would be something that was signed in every case, and there was an official record every time. And now just a little minute entry that goes into your case management system, that are often done on the fly. Those are court records. And so when you have policies and you're creating your policies, you need to make sure of what you're doing with that stuff. What does that stuff mean? Is that stuff legally operative, or are we going to allow clerks to do that stuff on every, is that we're going to have that flexibility for them, or how tight or how loose are we going to be on that? And I think that's where you see the issue of reliability being an important one. Integrity, I think we've kind of talked about that, How do we make sure it is what we actually say it is? And usability. Usability both in the current time and also future usability. So we're talking about, and Niall's going to get into this in much greater detail later, but usability of crossing different systems, being able to maintain this, being able to archive it. One of the things we mentioned in our white paper is that our end users, the citizens, they don't care where they're coming to get the record. They don't necessarily even know the difference between the state and the federal court or municipal court. All they know is that they had to go to court and they got a record and they want it. And they want to be able to get that record and have it make sense to them. And they don't care that this system doesn't talk to the other system. So if you're getting data from the prosecutors and it comes to the courts and it's not right, you can't just say, well, the prosecutor didn't send it right. It's not the right file. Well, the user doesn't care about that. That's irrelevant to the user. So your systems have to be usable across the spectrum. And so that requires collaboration with agency partners. And so that's something to think about when you're creating policies, and something that I know COSCA was very interested in making sure was clear in the paper, that we need to view usability from the perspective of the person using the document, not from our perspectives.
And these characteristics are part of an ISO standard. This is the most basic records management standard. There's a great deal of them, but as far as a sort of a good place to start, ISO 15489 goes into a great deal of detail at the general level about what good records management programs entail. So it's worth taking a look at. We think that there's really two major elements to integrity. One is the technical and the infrastructure requirements for maintaining the integrity of records. We're focusing in this presentation more on electronic records because that's really the direction that we're going. And of course that involves a lot of familiar activities in terms of backups and redundancy and storage and so forth. And also critical that we be able to document that the chain of custody in a record has been maintained, particularly a record that has legal value, such as a judgment or order. And then part of it too is just plain processes and procedures that you have implemented in your office to make sure that staff understand what their responsibilities are for maintaining record integrity. And here we think the electronic records, there are in particular some issues that you need to start to address if you haven't already.
And one of the things that, we have a couple of places here we want to break it up with some audience feedback, and this is one of those locations. I mean, how many of you have a policy of validating records authentication? So there is some sort of a testing process or a procedure where you're verifying what your electronic records are from time to time, where you're, I see a couple of hands, 3 or 4. What are you doing that,
Process.
you know, what processes do you have that you're doing?
Well, on the front end, when I work in a federal bankruptcy court, and so 90% of my documents come in electronically from attorneys, 10% come in paper, we scan, and then we destroy the paper within 30 days. So our case-related records, not the administrative stuff, the
Sure.
case-related records are electronic. We have processes in place to review the electronic filings that come in over the internet, and then also the scanned records by a second person to make sure that the scan is accurate, or if the one that's e-filed that comes in, we're assessing that as well to make sure it corresponds to the appropriate docket entry. And so we have a manual process where we go in and do a 100% check on everything that comes in.
Do you or anybody else have a system where you're checking who inside the firewall has access to that and who has accessed it? Is that part of any kind of an auditing process that anybody does?
Transaction logs of everybody and all activity that goes on in the system.
Okay.
A lot of this may be going on without, I mean, if you're a non-technology person like me, may be going on behind the scenes with your IT people, such as obviously your logs, and there may be some internal audit controls, some checksums. Checksums are a way of determining if a document, an electronic document, has gone in and remains in the same format and the same content and so forth as it is currently. So those are very critical to checking the integrity of electronic records. And so it's a good thing to have a discussion, I think, with your IT people if this is a concern, needs to be a concern of yours, particularly for very critical records, is what are they doing to ensure that the records, that what went in is what's still in there. And we'll talk about migration, and when you get into migrating records as a preservation technique, it becomes even more critical that you be able to determine when you migrate a record that the record that went through the migration process is still has retained its integrity to as much as possible. So these are, again, more technical issues, but very, very important in the electronic records world.
I think from a business and even an HR perspective, what controls are you as court managers putting on IT staff? Do you have a separate access point to your security director, for example, to where you can independently, on the business side, verify what you're being told by the IT staff? I mean, 99 times out of 100, you're not going to need it, but that 1% is going to be really bad if it doesn't work right. So you need to be able to make sure that there are checks and balances. You know, and one of the things that's recommended, I know, by the National Center for State Courts in terms of when they talk about organization is having a separate reporting chain for that security piece, or at least a separate access that the administrators or the clerks would have the ability to control that. Because if you don't have that, your record's integrity could be compromised. And that's an important thing to make sure you're maintaining. Anything else on that piece?
Question here?
Yeah.
Comment?
I don't know about documents, checks are sufficient, I mean, do you need that, or do you need to have basically a backup, an archival version of the document?
I think it depends on whether it's whether it's a static document, for instance, or whether it's accessed frequently. I think that's a good question to ask somebody that's more technical than I am, but I think the answer to that depends on how critical the record is and how frequently it's accessed, or whether it's just laying in an archive somewhere and it's not, you're not pulling the record. A lot of times when you, and maybe you guys do this in the federal courts, when you provide an electronic record, you're not actually pulling that, you're making a copy and then providing a copy, and then there's some protections in there.
Okay, the principle of access, and we talked a little bit about this. This addresses the ability of the court staff, litigants, and the public to access information to which they are entitled. I think most importantly, the public, to make sure that the public can get the information in the format that they want it. But then, what information is the public entitled to? What are your policies that relate to levels of access? Who can have access to what records and for how long? We'll talk about some of the technical requirements of this, but there's more than just a technical aspect to this. I mean, we're getting to the point with some technology, perhaps, that with the growing pace that memory is growing, you could maintain these records for a lot longer than we thought we were going to be able to maintain them. I just moved over to the federal court, and I had assumed that there would be some sort of a records destruction policy off of the archiving off of the system, and there isn't at the federal level. It's just we just keep it forever, as far as I know. I mean, I'm looking over here to see if I'm wrong about that because I've only been there 2 weeks, but so I don't know if that's true. Maybe I'll learn that later, but these things are developing. In the state of Missouri, where I came from, we don't have that policy yet as to when things archive off the system. Who has access to it and for how long. And also litigants. I mean, we have partners. We have, the prosecutors maybe have different record access levels than other folks. What can the public defender see? When can they see it? When can police see what they see? And so you have to have different standards of access and maybe different levels of access depending on the individual and who's coming into the system.
And again, there are a lot of elements to access, and Greg has mentioned many of them. I want to say something about metadata, and I wasn't quite sure where to put this in the presentation because metadata really is an issue in several levels, including preservation and disposition. But I did want to mention it here because metadata is critical to getting at records. Without the proper metadata there, you can't retrieve the information, and we've actually seen sort of horror stories, not very many of them, where courts have gone out and adopted imaging systems and have been sold systems where there's very little metadata collected. We had a court that went out and decided to scan all the records for archives, and the only way they could get at them was going back through them sequentially, document by document, until they found the right document. And that is a symptom of a system that was not set up with adequate metadata by any means. And so that's very, very critical to electronic records. There's all kinds of metadata standards. Probably the most widely known or recognized is the Dublin Core metadata, which was developed not in Ireland, as I always thought, but in Ohio near Columbus. For a Michigan grad, that's kind of hard. But anyway. There are a number of them, and there are also a number of uses for metadata, both preservation metadata, administrative metadata. We won't go into all the details, and most of us don't have to know all those details, but it's important to understand that the metadata is important and that you can have a discussion with your technical people and your vendors about how metadata is entered and what types of metadata you have in your records, particularly your electronic documents. And as Greg mentioned, of course, security and access control is very, very important. And as we mentioned on integrity, and again, why these principles are interrelated, the importance of audit trails and user authentication and authorization and so forth. A key issue we wanted to briefly mention here today was third-party use of court information. It's probably not interesting to many of you, but it really is becoming an issue. When I turn on my email, my private email in the morning, I often get an advertisement of a company that's going to soon have hundreds of millions of court records available online for you at a subscription price. You can find out about your doctors and your girlfriends and your boyfriends and your in-laws and everybody in the world. And of course, the scary thing about that is that all this information goes out there. Is it correct when it goes out there? How long does it stay out there? One of the real concerns that's, when we talk about electronic records and electronic records disposition in a minute, is that if we destroy records pursuant to our retention schedule, but a third party decides to keep a criminal record out there for a longer period of time, what happens if someone wants a correction or wants to come back and go back to that record? Likewise, what is there to ensure that a third party updates a record when there's an expungement or a change or a correction or a satisfaction of judgment? My colleague Larry Murphy former CIO from Iowa lived through this. They had a policy that a third party had to sign an agreement that when they took the information and they posted it, they would also have to, it would be required to subscribe to the updates. And the AOC or the IT would provide those updates. Company that was posting information posted some information that apparently was incorrect or did an expungement. Maybe you're familiar. Was it an expungement? Okay, it was an expungement. They didn't post it. They came back and they sued the court for it. The court, or the AOC, they were able to show that we have a policy. The vendor was provided with the policy. The update was provided to the vendor on this date, and the vendor had an obligation to implement the update, to enter the update. The AOC was not found liable for it, and the company went out of business, probably as a result of that incident. But that just points to how I think it's going to be even more and more of a problem as more information becomes available electronically. Now, do any of you have third-party policies that govern the length of time that information is out, or these kind of updates similar to what I described in Iowa? Is that any states?
What about selling the data?
Selling? Yeah. Once? Okay. Okay. All right. Yes.
But you know, it gets out there somehow.
Yeah.
It just does.
You know, whether we have an agreement or not, we have no agreement, we don't provide any access, and somehow we deal with the expungement issue too, probably, once a
Yeah.
question comes
Yeah.
in, or, typically a criminal background check, so, I don't, we gotta, we're frustrated, we're trying to find a way to keep keep it handled.
Yeah, yeah. And this when we talk about disposition, retention in particular, this goes to that issue. Is should there be a different retention period for electronic records than there is currently for paper records? And we'll talk about that in just a second. But to essentially try and deal with these issues where records may be posted incorrectly or inaccurately and ensure that people have the right to access. It's interesting, talking of Europe again, the International Court of Justice about a month or two ago ruled that people have a right, that there is a right to forget, that people have the right to have information which is not in the public interest removed from the internet. I think Google went ape over that. I read, the most recent update on it I read was that Google Europe was getting 10,000 requests a day to remove information from the internet. And of course, it hasn't gotten to this country. It may never get to this country. But that has kind of changed things a little bit. And it'll be interesting. Unfortunately, unfortunately for Google, I guess, the European Court of Justice judgment or decision was a little bit short on details and kind of left it for them to figure out what's in the public interest. So no surprise there. But very, very interesting case, and it's had real ramifications for, for the publication of information on the web. So, yeah. Okay. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention is anybody here, a couple of years ago, Jim McMillan did a piece on this concept of digital rights management, which is a technical way of controlling access or controlling how information, once released, is utilized, how long it can be utilized. I just wondered if anybody out here has any experience with this, is using it, DRM? No. That's been the response I've gotten in most places. I'm not sure how realistic it is for the large volumes of information that potentially we release to third parties, but just wanted to get a sense if anybody had any experience with that or not. So I guess not. It's still a concept mostly.
Is this our last principle before we
No.
get into
Disposition.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So the principle of disposition. We've kind of talked a lot about this already, and as you see, a lot of these principles are very interrelated. But at some point, every record has an end, and this is where records go to die, right? And what do we do with them when they're done? Well, we mothball and put them in the moldy room with the spiders. We used to do that. We were talking about that at the beginning. Or, now, where do they go? How long do we keep them for? And so you have to have policies that deal with long-term archival storage and whether or not something is scheduled for destruction. There was something on a prior slide that mentioned this. Do you need a different standard for electronic records destruction than you do for paper records destruction? Should it be the same length of time? Should the media matter? Should the delivery system, if you will, make a difference as to how long you keep that record? Or are there different types of destruction? Could you archive it for purposes of the public, but retain it for purposes of verifying the existence of that record? Should that be necessary at a later date in a lawsuit? For example, whether or not something exists or say what it purports to say. Or for enhancement purposes. Perhaps you'd see prosecutors, they're very interested in keeping records alive as long as they can for enhancement purposes, whereas the public may not be so interested in that. And so there's competing interests. And the courts, a lot of these things are handled through court rules that don't necessarily go through the legislative process. And so there's a lot of responsibility that comes into this principle of disposition. I think there are lots of technical ways to do this, but I think really the governance piece of it is really important. How long do you keep it, and for what ends do you keep it?
In the records management field, when we talk about disposition, you talk about sort of three separate activities. One is appraising records for their value, and then whether they are archived or whether they are destroyed according to some kind of a schedule. And an appraisal is just an assessment of what a document is worth, what its value is. Fortunately, in the court environment, for the most part, our case-related records are already on schedules. So we don't go through the lengthy process of appraising records and so forth. But I mentioned earlier unstructured records. Some of those records may not be covered by a retention schedule, and in that case, an appraisal is certainly a valuable activity. These are what, in the records community, are considered the sort of the four major areas or the four determinants of record value. And I think they apply very well to the court environment as well. And again, fortunately, a lot of that has already been laid out, at least as far as paper records are concerned, in the existing records retention schedules that we have. Now, archiving really is a kind of disposition because it's taking a record off of an active status, essentially, and putting it into essentially a cardboard box and putting it away for a long period of time, if not forever. Retention schedules in this country, particularly for general jurisdiction courts, are very, very long. They're 50 years, 70 years, 100 years, permanent. So archiving has become, electronic archiving is going to become an increasingly important task and activity as we move from the paper environment into electronic environment. And that can be done, in many states, it's done by what's called accession to another agency, which typically is the state archives. How many of you are allowed or required to ship records to the state archives, to some kind of archives? Okay, Ohio, the feds, Washington State. Yeah, a number of states. In fact, Washington State now takes electronic records for archives, from what I understand, and you don't even have to have them in archival format. So I don't know what kind of voodoo they do to convert them for archival quality, but they do that. Several states. I came from Michigan, most of my career in Michigan, and we were allowed to accession paper records to the state archives. One little bit of caution, though, there was a survey done in 2013 about the readiness of state archives in this country to actually engage in digital preservation, and I think only 13 of the states, and they surveyed all 50 states and 4 territories, only 13 state archives met minimal requirements for preservation of digital records according to the criteria that were used in the study. And the study was performed by the Council of State Archivists, so it wasn't like it was some outside outfit that came in and did it. That's kind of a sobering revelation. So if the archives aren't ready to archive, how ready are we to archive? I think that's, kind of the question electronically. Yes, ma'am.
Now, are you talking about general archives because some state courts have their own system for doing that?
Yes, they do. I was referring to a separate agency, like a state historical society. Some of them are the historical societies or state archives. They're a separate agency, executive branch agency often, as opposed to an internal, which really would be transferring them to an internal agency.
Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, destruction, there's a whole set of requirements for destroying electronic records, depending on the type of records they are and security levels. There are some very good standards materials out there for this, and you know, electronic destruction in a lot of ways is like paper destruction. It's something that you need to make sure you have a clear trail of events and approval and everything for electronic records. The thing with electronic records, though, is that there always is the capability of setting up a system which automatically destroys records which have reached a certain point and have reached the end of their life cycle if they meet those particular requirements. Does anybody have a system out there for, no? Okay, not yet. They're out there and they're available, but obviously it hasn't reached the shores of the courts yet. Again, I mentioned you know, the importance of tracking what you're doing there, and the destruction depends on the media content and the media itself. And sometimes it's helpful to do an inventory of your records. I know when I was a clerk, we used to do a manual inventory of all of our records periodically just to see if we had covered everything, if we had anything in the collection that was ready for destruction or ready for archives that we could move out of our collection. And so same thing in the digital world. So any digital hoarders out here? Okay, easy to do, isn't it? It's easy to become a digital hoarder because, you know, you just kind of hit the save button and stuff just goes someplace onto a server, and, you know, you don't have to worry about it. I think sooner or later this is going to start to catch up with us. For those of you that have electronic document management systems, in other words, you scan, do any of you have a plan or a policy in place for destruction of electronic documents that have reached the end of their retention period? Nobody. Okay. All right. So how do you deal with it? What do you do with it? Just add disks? Okay. All right. Well, storage is cheap. Storage is cheap. There's no doubt about it. But think about eventually, and of course depends on the size of your court, the cost of managing that storage, the cost of migration when you have to migrate that information, the cost of searching it when you have to search it. I was out in a court, and this may be true for some of you, that had been e-filing for a good number of years on the civil side and was eventually going to implement full e-filing, just like some of the federal courts are doing now. That court had 16 million documents on its server. It was a fairly good-sized court. And the retention schedule for that court varied from 5 years to permanent. The court had absolutely no plan, no procedures in place, either for archiving records that they had to retain for long periods of time, nor did it have any plan for destroying records, some of which probably could have been destroyed 5 to 10 years ago. Again, I guess that seems to be the trend right now, but we really want to, you know, start getting people to think about what, you know, what needs to be done in this area. And part of it may be that there just is a lack of guidance in the existing retention schedules. Any thoughts on that? Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm from the 15th Circuit in Palm Beach County, Florida.
Yeah.
And I'm the court reporting manager. So we just started electronically archiving our digital recordings.
Mm-hmm.
And our court staff, you know, he's in here, but we do have a retention policy. They will be deleting their records once they reach
Okay.
their retention policies. I think felonies 10 years, misdemeanors 5 years.
Okay.
Et cetera. I think if it's a capital case, we have to keep it indefinitely. So depending on what the classification is, they
Yeah.
will delete the record.
Yeah, I mean, right now, you know, if you don't have really high volumes, you can kind of get away with it. You can kind of go along, but I think sooner or later, it's something that we're all going to have to come to grips with. And that's, you know, in the destruction or the archiving of these electronic records.
So we've talked a little bit about what you preserve and then preservation. I think the last principle, and as we've mentioned before, they're all related, but this is the how. You know, the need to maintain the integrity and accessibility of records throughout their life cycle. You know, how do you do that? You know, that, and this is something that we could have mentioned at any point prior to this, but there's a training aspect to all of this as well. I mean, not only do you have to come up with these standards and you have to have the technology that is necessary to maintain them, but you also have to train your staff on how to do it and how to use all this stuff. And that's where the principle of preservation comes into play. You need people to be able to maintain that integrity for you. That's all of our jobs, making sure that we have training plans for employees that can keep us up to snuff with technology and where technology is going. And also from the tech side of the coin, preservation, refers to migrating of versions, going to the latest version of Adobe. What is the standard when you're talking about maintaining a record long term? Are we talking about microfilm still? There are machines out there that will take your digital record and burn it to microfilm, and you can keep that as your permanent standard. I know in Missouri State Courts, we're embarking on a project to look at purchasing that because that's the way our Secretary of State wants the record. So we're going to go from digital to microfilm for permanent storage. And it's crazy. It sounds crazy, but I think the thinking of that for a lot of people is that, it's kind of the Planet of the Apes theory. Like if everything breaks down, that sucker's still going to run, right? I mean, that's kind of what they're getting at, the nightmare scenario. And so that's a part of this. We got all this stuff. How does it convert? What happens when a virus comes through? That's what preservation is there to make you think about.
I won't go into a lot of detail because we're running out of time, but this information is available on the slides, some of the fundamental activities. I did want to mention this. This is an illustration that came from a site called savingthedigitalworld.com. It's an interesting place to go, and they basically claim that under the way current IT data centers are set up, that almost all of the information in those data centers will be lost within the next 25 years. I can't agree or disagree with this, but it's an interesting perspective, and it's what a lot of people who are in the business think about the current digital preservation prospects. I won't get a lot into this. I think most of you understand these concepts of media longevity and obsolescence and so forth. We've been living with it for a long, long time. There are a number of factors that affect the risk to records, especially electronic records, which have to be taken into consideration. Hardware challenges. Hardware has changed. Computers continue to change. And just as a little reminder, there's a site called, the Cornell University has this site called the Chamber of Horrors, and it's all of this old technology, and I just picked a couple of them out, and of course some of these, we've used in the past, all of us have used. But the interesting thing about it is, even though I randomly picked these out, the average lifespan for any one of these technologies, these storage technologies, is 10 years. So that's kind of sobering. That's why you don't save important stuff on thumb drives, right? And of course, software and formats, and those who remember WordPerfect 5.1 like me when it was really just great stuff. Methods of preservation, active and passive. Migration is probably the most important active preservation methodology, and it requires some planning and probably what we'll all eventually have to come to grips with. And many of you have already migrated if you've had legacy case management systems and you've had to move from one vendor to another. You've already been through this. You know what a pain this is. At some point, probably have to do it with all of your documents. All of your image documents as well will have to be migrated into new formats and so forth. Some sort of short-term preservation approaches for those that don't have such long retention periods, emulation, refreshing, so forth. So those are available as well, and I won't go into a lot of detail. One important issue, though, is formatting. And the records management community, what you're seeing right now is a lot of attention to archival formats and the importance of open formats as opposed to proprietary formats. And PDF-A is an archival version of PDF. I think the federal courts now have gone from TIFF to PDF on filing to is it PDF-A, Norm? PDF-A. PDF-A is, and PDF-A though is already up on version 3, but PDF-A for documents has become kind of the standard, and in fact it is an ISO standard. So you know, if you have digital documents that require long-term preservation, this is something you might want to learn more about. You know, what are you currently saving in? A lot of systems typically save in TIFF because it's pretty easy, but if you have long-term storage, there may be some need to convert to PDFA. I'm not the authority on that, but there's a lot of really good information out there on this, so I encourage you to look it up. Cloud technology, we could do a whole piece on that, but I think that you know, there's certainly advantages, and this may be one solution to long-term preservation is for courts to get together and create private clouds so that each court doesn't have to individually manage its own archives, and I think there's some potential in that. So I'll just put that out there for your consideration. Just bottom line, have a preservation strategy, whatever you do, so that you know you're planning ahead. I also wanted to mention a concept that's very popular right now with in the records management field. That's an idea of a trusted digital repository. This again is an ISO standard. The standard is referred to as the Open Archive Information System, not to be confused with e-filing OASIS. This is OAIS, and this is a whole set of sort of elements that involve both technical aspects and management aspects of archives. The National Archives and Records Administration has adopted this, so I have a feeling this is the direction it's going, and probably it's going to percolate first down to the federal courts perhaps, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So the last thing we want to do is cover just real quickly about governance, and we're running out of time.
Where is it? It's done?
Are we about time?
I think we're on time. We done, I think.
We're done.
I think we're on time, out of time.
Okay.
We talked about governance enough, but
Yeah.
is there any other questions that people have before we go they wanted us to touch on?
I just want to mention one thing here in terms of the material we gave you. I gave you some organizations that are standards organizations. We have this records management maturity model available. If anybody is interested in it, then we put it together at the National Center. It's a self-assessment to look at your total records program. I gave you the link to it. If you're interested in it and want to try and implement it, we'd love to work with you on it and love to know, you know, are we asking the right questions and that sort of thing. So please get back with me if you are. There's going to be a lot more going on through COSCA and NACM in terms of records and continuing to work on these issues. And we, of course, encourage your involvement and contribution in that. And then finally, some organizations if you're really interested in this records management stuff, it really excites you, here's some organizations that you might consider being involved with. So thank you very much. Enjoyed it.